Hi, everyone. Welcome back to This Week at Neighbors Together. This is a weekly series that we're doing to showcase our staff and their efforts right now at Neighbors Together to just show you what we're doing during this time and to help you understand our work a bit more. This week, I am joined by Marlon Jean-Michel, who is one of the best coworkers you can ever imagine, and he is our supportive housing specialist here at Neighbors Together. Marlon, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, no problem, no problem.
So I am really thrilled to talk to you about your role at Neighbors Together. Can you talk to me about how long you've been at Neighbors Together and what your role was like when you first got here and how that's evolved to now?
Yeah, so I joined Neighbors Together in November of 2017. So going on 3 years in November of this year. I started out part-time as the supportive housing assistant. I was supporting at the time, the current supportive housing specialist with everything from setting up appointments for psychiatric evaluations, helped out with filling out applications, getting necessary documents in, and making sure all that stuff was set up. So during that time, I was also working at another job, so I was kind of juggling both positions part time. And then about a year into the role, I was asked to transition full time. A year or so, I think almost a year in, I was asked to transition, and then from then on, I've kind of spearheaded the position myself as a one-man team.
Yes, it's definitely a one-man and very effective and organized team. We all really appreciate Marlon's organization systems. So can you talk about so you work in our empowerment program, which is our social services program at Neighbors Together. Can you talk about where you fit into the empowerment program and what you specifically focus on?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I am part of the empowerment program at Neighbors Together, and so we provide direct services. It consists mainly of myself, Miriam, and Suzanne. Miriam, our member advocate, and Suzanne, our housing advocate. They focus primarily on, I would say, what I like to refer to as general housing. And so that can be anything from low-income housing to any senior housing that might be out there, the regular housing market, just through general online searches and things like that. But I focus specifically on supportive housing, which exists for folks who have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness. And so that can range from anything from major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, what they like to consider serious mental illness. That's HRA's term verbiage. Yeah. And typically a lot of members that I assist have also had substance abuse issues. So there can be a myriad of struggles that they have in addition to housing.
Yeah.
So in my role, I see the intersection of substance use, as I mentioned, homelessness, and serious mental illness, and how all three aspects can really affect a person's well-being.
Right. Thank you for that beautiful overview. For supportive housing, where are supportive housing units located around the city? You said this is a specific type of housing for people with mental health disorders that you described via HRA's description. And where are these units and how do people find them?
Tough. So there are several options, right? As far as housing within supportive housing. So you have what's called congregate housing, which can be, let's say, I have an organization under my name, Marlon's Housing, right? So as a congregate site, there might be everything on location, from psychiatric services to case management, medication management, depending on the level of care that person needs. And so it's kind of like a one-stop shop, so to speak. Everything is on one central location. So that person might not necessarily even need to leave the building in order to attend all their appointments. While you can have a scattered site unit or apartment, which can be just generally located in the community, in a regular looking building, so to speak. and it might not even be identifiable as a supportive housing unit. And they're located in all 5 boroughs. Some boroughs do have more locations than others. Like Brooklyn, for example, is a hotspot. A lot of people want to either stay in Brooklyn or move to Brooklyn. Um, the Bronx is another location that has a lot of supportive housing. Queens, so it does vary depending on the organizations. But yeah, they're pretty. I would say they're pretty well spaced out throughout the city.
And what is the process that someone goes through? I know you talked about some of the qualifications for supportive housing and some of the qualifications that we specifically at Neighbors Together focus on. What does this process look like for someone coming to you to go through the process of obtaining supportive housing? Is that easy? Is it difficult? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's I would say it's pretty difficult, only because there's a lot of paperwork involved, which can be, of course, a barrier to a lot of our members as far as access, understanding the process. So generally, to try and keep it as short as possible, folks would have to, it's recommended that they're already in psychiatric treatment, so in therapy of some sort. They would have to get a psychosocial and psychiatric evaluation done, and those would have to be done within 6 months of the submission of the application. If it's any older than that, HRA won't really be willing to accept it. They want as much new information as possible, and so along with the HRA 2010E application, which I would fill out online, those 3 documents are submitted to HRA. And so it consists of demographic information from, social security number to whether they're receiving food stamps or cash assistance, covers any housing history, about 4 years worth, covers any substance use issues that our members might have had in the past. So it's really an all-encompassing look of kind of their life, a bit of a snapshot, to give HRA and the supportive housing provider kind of a look at who they are, and what supports they would need. So the turnaround time for the application is pretty quick, about 2 to 3 days. After we receive what is called a determination letter, we find out whether that person was approved or not, and then from there, the process gets a lot more tedious because the application has to be sent out to each housing provider that that either falls under the preferences of that person. So let's say folks want to look at a particular borough, or for non-shared housing versus shared housing. The application is then sent out to organizations accordingly, and then from there it's kind of a waiting game. They might be placed on a wait list. There might be a vacancy available for them immediately, but that usually doesn't happen too often. So
right. So thank you for outlining that. I think it's important for people to know that the application process is usually the quicker process in completing this process, correct?
Yeah, definitely. And it can be tough for folks who have not had any psychiatric treatment, recently, because then they would have to get back in the groove, or just completely start, seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist, and that could be tough for some folks. But that's definitely the easier part of the process when compared to the housing search part, which can take anywhere from 6 months, a year, 2 years. It's really hard to say, and that's sometimes the frustrating part, because folks will say, do you have an estimate of how long I can wait? And I don't want to lie to anybody and say, yeah, I can find you something in 3 months, and then a year or 3 months later they're still waiting. So I always try to be as transparent as possible and let them know that it's really hard to say, whether they'll be able to find something, like I said, in 6 months, a year, 2 years. There's a lot of varying factors that play into it.
Right. For this process, I think that it's important to know that there's a big distinction between completing the application and finding someone a spot in that unit.
Yes.
At Neighbors Together, we made a conscious decision to not just fill out the application, because we realized, lots of people can have this application filled out, and that is the first step, of course, but the real change comes from when we are placing someone in a housing unit and when they find housing. And that is the difficult part that you were talking about. Can you elaborate on, I know you mentioned that you personally have to reach out to or send this application to all of the units, that someone would qualify to be placed in, and have that qualification match their needs. What do those units look like those buildings? I mean, and I would imagine you can't just send it out to currently right now to a broad listing of places and just have everything be, out there. You have to go individually, right?
Yeah. And to be, fully honest, when I first started, that was kind of one of the things I noticed. It was like, okay, you have a dartboard and just throwing 1,000 darts at the board, but you would never really hit anything. And then I realized that not only do folks have preferences as far as what they're looking for, the supportive housing organizations also have preferences as far as who they consider an ideal tenant. So there's a lot of overlap there, and it's like you mentioned, it's you have to specifically kind of target where you want to send the application, just to be not only considerate of that person, of your member's time, so, being mindful of resources as well. Like there's a lot that goes into it, but you also don't want to send an application somewhere, have that person attend an interview, and then it not be what they were expecting, which I have had happen, so it was definitely a learning experience for me, just being mindful of the fact that although this person is struggling right now, let's say with the housing issue, it doesn't mean that they don't have the right to, sort of say, I'm not comfortable with this setting, or I don't want to live in Manhattan because all my family and resources and services are located in Brooklyn, and it would be tough for me to travel all the way there because I have, a bad hip, or I just don't do well on public transportation for whatever reason. So there are a lot of details involved, from, like I said, a big thing that comes up is just being mindful of the fact that a lot of people do not want to share an apartment. We're serving a population that's typically older, and they've been through a lot in a lot of cases. So it's totally understandable that they don't want to have a roommate. Some people have cleanliness standards that they want to abide by. Some people just don't do well with others. So there are a lot of different factors that tie in, and that's something that I'm always very mindful of. I always tell folks, if you don't want to share an apartment, for example, the housing search is going to be a lot tougher, because that just narrows down our options as far as how many organizations we're able to reach out to. But if that's what you want to do, then, by all means, I'm there to support and,
Right.
Guide you through that process.
Right, because when somebody is placed in supportive housing with another person, they're not going to know who their roommate is, correct?
Exactly. So they'll go on an interview, right? They might let the interviewer know, hey, I don't mind sharing an apartment. And then once a vacancy becomes available, they are offered the opportunity to meet with that person. However brief or long that conversation may be, of course depends, but it's not really enough to get a full feel for who that person is, what their living habits might be like. You never know until you're actually in that situation.
Yeah.
And so, I have had situations where, I've helped place a person before. I thought everything was good. I follow up 2-3 months later, and then I find out, they have a roommate from hell. So a lot of times, I would say most of the times, the organization is pretty proactive in, trying to resolve any situations or tension that might come up. I did have a member who I visited earlier this year, actually, right before COVID really hit, and he was telling me how the roommate situation that he was in was really bad, but the organization was able to move him to another apartment, and everything turned out great in that case. So yeah, that's something that is always important to look out for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for illuminating that. And I think it's really important for people watching to know that the process of finding an apartment is much longer than one might think, than the process of that application. And then also understanding our members' needs is at the forefront of what we do in order to help us submit these applications to the right places. And I think it's important to know that this is not a perfect system, and we have a lot of thoughts on how it could be improved as well. I also think that making sure people are heard in these conversations is really important and something that we really focus on at Neighbors Together. But you are only one person, and you're doing a lot in your role. And so we do have a waiting list at Neighbors Together for supportive housing. Can you make the distinction between the waiting list for any applications or placements? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, definitely. So I always tell folks I'm always willing to help out with anything I can, whether it's just typing up a psychosocial for somebody or helping them get their full packet together with all the documents needed for the housing process. So the active caseload is essentially members that I'm helping with the housing search piece, and then the wait list are folks who are either waiting to be put on the active caseload for the housing search help, or they're just receiving help with the application. I'm always willing to help out with the application, regardless of whether I'm going to ultimately help you with the housing search or not, because I know that's a big barrier for a lot of folks. There just is not really anywhere for them to get the application done. And then there's a difference between getting it done and then getting it done properly. Not to say that I haven't made mistakes in the past or that I'm perfect or anything, but there's a lot of nuances and details that need to be included within the application for that person to really get the most out of their placement ultimately.
Right.
Details from they might be in this wheelchair, for example, and they might not be able to do well in the building unless they're on the first floor. So something like that, for example, is something that needs to be illuminated. Whether it's something that they might be comfortable with in the apartment that they want illuminated in the psychosocial, it's very important to include those things in there. So folks on the wait list typically, they typically do have to wait a while, because I'm only able to move somebody over to the active caseload once I've placed somebody into supportive housing, which, like I mentioned, can take some time and is kind of unpredictable.
Right, and there are only so many supportive housing units, and there are only so many units that might fit someone's needs.
Exactly.
And I think this is really calling on the fact that we need more support for supportive housing units and more a better system to integrate all of these needs in a quicker way. Because when people are waiting a year or 2 years, like you're saying, and they're on that list with you, and you're advocating for them, and you're trying to place them into housing, where are they living? Where are members living?
It's tough, because some folks are fortunate enough to be able to stay with family and friends while they're waiting. The best case scenario is that they don't have any time restraints as far as when they need to move out or anything like that. But I also have folks who are street homeless that I'm working with, which we know with everything going on with COVID can be. I can't even imagine how stressful that can be. I also work with folks who are living in shelters in the Bronx, Ward Island, here in Brooklyn. So I have a full spectrum of folks, with different living situations or homelessness situations. And the most stressful is definitely, I would say, the folks who are street homeless, or those who may have some place to stay but have to move out by a certain time. Because then it's kind of like you said, like what are their options? Where do they go? And we know the conditions in many shelters in the city. It's horrendous. I hear terrible stories all the time from our members, and so that's often the most stressful part of the whole transaction, right, between me and members, because they're and rightfully so, they are receiving a lot of pressure just based on the fact that they don't have anywhere to live. And even if they do have somewhere to live, they might not necessarily be comfortable or safe in that space. And so that is often my biggest struggle, for sure.
Yeah. I think it's a big struggle for all of us at Neighbors Together, just understanding that these systems need improvement, and that having someone on the street for a year while they're waiting for a supportive housing unit is really dangerous and really not ideal. And especially if they're coming to us for supportive housing and they need treatment, or they need something that is an additional support, because we know housing changes everything for someone. So you mentioned COVID, and one of the reasons why we started this, or the reason why we started this weekly check-in at Neighbors Together, is to help people understand what our services looked like before COVID and how they looked after COVID. And you've outlined so much of what your role is at Neighbors Together, and going into what goes into the process of finding supportive housing. And before COVID, you were doing this in the office. So can you talk to me about what your job looked like before COVID, and then we'll go into how things have changed?
Yeah, so typical day, I would come in, hop on ETO, which is our sort of database for everything Neighbors Together. So yeah, I would hop on ETO, make sure my notes were updated. And then from there, I would typically have an outline from the day before of, what needs to be done for a particular member. Check my voicemails, see what faxes came in, emails and things like that. And then my typical day consists of typing up psychosocials for folks, reviewing psychiatric documents, making sure that everything is up to date and accurate, filling out applications, the 2010 application for supportive housing. Depending on the day, like a Tuesday, for example, we would typically have our psychiatric evaluations done through Janian Medical Services. And so it's a lot of meetings. It would be a lot of in-person meetings with folks, preliminary meetings sometimes, just letting them know what supportive housing is. Because a lot of times they might have heard about it, but they don't really know the particulars and the ins and outs. So a lot of preliminary meetings to see if the services would fit them and their needs. A lot of folks just dropping by saying, "Hey, what's going on? Have you found anything yet?" And that's usually the toughest conversation. Like, still looking. My favorite phrase is, "I'll let you know if I find anything."
I've heard you say that a lot.
And I mean it. Once something comes up, I always say, I'll give you a call as soon as I can. It's a lot of outreach as well to supportive housing providers, just to see if there are any particular populations, which is another aspect of supportive housing that can be confusing. Depending on the person's history, they might fall under a particular population, ranging from A to, I believe, G. A lot of faxes being sent out, mailings, sending packets out to different organizations. So a large part of my job is meeting with folks, talking to them about their situation, seeing what would fit, whether I would have to refer them to Miriam or Suzanne or another one of our services, refer out to a different organization. And then, like I said, there are a lot of outreach to housing providers just to see what's out there.
Right, and you were doing this in person with members, and the great thing about Neighbors Together in our space is there will be open office hours for Miriam, or having people come meet with you, and scheduling appointments to come meet with you, and it's very low barrier. People can walk through the door, come get a meal, and understand maybe some of our services. And they might not have known about supportive housing, or maybe they've been referred to us by another organization. But you were actively in the space meeting with folks. And how has that changed since COVID? And how has that affected your role and the efficiency of supportive housing right now?
Yeah, it's tough. I would say it's definitely, I don't want to say put a stop to the housing search, but it's definitely slowed it down considerably. I know that during this time, just reaching out to housing providers has been difficult. just to get somebody on the phone, because a lot of us have transitioned to working from home. So just being able to get information has been tough. Finding out whether there are vacancies, um, and even though there might be vacancies, it's difficult. I could imagine, especially on the supportive housing end, as far as the providers go, because just the whole fact that everybody's been quarantined for such a long time, having to maintain social distance, it's tough to have interviews. So a lot of organizations, well, I can only say rather a couple of organizations that I was able to get in contact with transitioned into phone screenings. And from what I can gather, a lot of movements have kind of been put on pause.
Right.
And so a lengthy process has been made, even longer. Um, and like we talked about before, when you're working with a population that's dealing with homelessness or unstable housing, that can only add to the stress and pressure of being able to of having to find housing and find stable housing, ultimately.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially when combating with living in a congregate shelter or on the street.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
know.
that's been a big issue for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, just being able to be comfortable in that space, especially if you're someone who, let's say, is OCD, for example. I can't even imagine, the stress of having to want to clean right your space and not being able to have those supplies.
Yeah.
So it's just little things like that kind of go missed and unnoticed.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the conversations we've had with Annie and Amy around the police sweeps that we're seeing happen on the subways, obviously there are, huge protests going on and there
Yeah.
are police actions, and now the curfews have been lifted, but when there were curfews happening, we were very concerned for our members who are street homeless and how they might be affected by these curfews.
Yeah.
And some of those people you have on your caseload and you're actively trying to help them find housing. I think with COVID, what we're seeing is also this barrier of people that, might not have a phone or access to a computer. How are you seeing that in your role?
Yeah, that's usually the toughest situation, where you kind of just feel helpless. You mentioned the phone. Um, people kind of take that for granted, right? We're always on our phones, whether it's social media, playing games, whatever your advice might be. But for someone just to have a regular working phone in 2020 is kind of taken for granted. Because I have several members who have had issues with phones or are currently having issues with phones, and to not be able to contact someone and say, "Hey, I need this paperwork to get you moved in," is a very frustrating experience. Um, just knowing, just feeling that helpless in that situation, and then comparing yourself to how they must feel, having to navigate and move around without a mobile device. As simple as that may seem, there are a lot of barriers to housing, outside of just finding housing. There's a lot that goes into it that people don't really consider.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think at Neighbors Together, it's part of our job to help people understand we must ask those critical questions and look at the big picture and understand. So much of our work is member-led and member-driven, and obviously with COVID hitting, it's very hard to communicate with our members who have barriers to communication like that, and I think not a lot of people might understand that. This might be too big of a question, but maybe I'm not sure. But what are some, we've talked with Natalie and Amy and Annie and Miriam about all of this was a problem before COVID, as you've outlined in your role and your job and the need. And it remains a problem, and it's been really highlighted after COVID. In your role, I think we've talked so many times as a staff about how we'd love to see improvements to supportive housing. What would you like to see improved around supportive housing?
The number one thing I would say is, well, maybe 1A and 1B, just vacancies, right? The number of apartments, of stable, suitable apartments. that are available for our members and folks across the city. I think that definitely needs to improve. We're in a very rich city, and the fact that we still can't figure out housing is very disappointing. It's a shame, to be quite honest. And that needs to really be looked at, I think, a lot deeper. So that's one, just the number of apartments that are available, and not just with supportive housing, just for the homeless population in general, but then accountability. I think with a lot of supportive housing providers, they're sort of they self-manage, right? There's really no overarching organization that you can go to and say, hey, I've been trying to get in touch with this supportive housing provider for 2-3 months now, and nobody has called me back about a vacancy. There's really nowhere you can go to hold them accountable for that. And I think that's something that really needs to be examined. And I think another thing that I would like to see is just more uniform screening across the board. Organizations kind of have the leeway to say this person would be an ideal tenant versus this person. And while I understand the argument for that, and being able to serve a particular population of folks depending on what support they might need, I think it's important to take into account the fact that people need housing, and so just because one person might be a little more work than someone else doesn't mean that they should be brushed aside, and then potentially their housing search has been lengthened by 2 or 3 months, because they weren't able to get into a particular program. So if I had to start anywhere, it'd probably be there.
Yeah, I think those are great observations and great places to start for sure, because you're seeing it every single day in your role. Is there anything else you might want to add about supportive housing before we wrap up?
I think that we like I said, we just need more of it.
Yeah.
HRA has, and I can't speak to all of them. They have done some things to really help ease the process, streamline the process, and make it easier on our members. So the application process is not really an issue. The issue, like we see in our role across housing, really, our neighbors together, is just availability. Folks are having to wait sometimes years to find an apartment that they can afford, and we're working with folks who are on fixed income, limited income, or sometimes no income, and so it doesn't mean that they're not deserving,
Yeah.
And so I think we just need more of it. If we had more available, I think we'd see that these folks do have a lot to offer. They do have value in that they can offer a lot to society. And I think if we're able to help these folks get back on their feet, that'll just help everybody in the long run, across the board.
Absolutely. 100% agree. And at Neighbors Together, one of the ways that we're tackling this is through our community action program and trying to change the policies in place. We're always actively talking as a team about how these things need to change and the actions that we can take around them. So if you're interested in learning more about our actions, you can head to our website, neighborstogether.org. If you're interested in donating to our work right now, you can head to neighborstogether.org/help. If you would like to talk to Marlon more about supportive housing, where can people reach you, Marlon?
So right now, since we're working out offsite, folks can reach me on my Google Voice number.
Great.
And that number is, pulling it up right now, 201-890-2981. You can also reach me by email if you have access to email, and that is at marlhon@neighborstogether.org.
Perfect. Thank you, Marlon. Thank you so much for being here and illuminating your role and what you're doing and how things have shifted, from what we were doing normally to after COVID, and just really shining a light on the supportive housing process and I don't know if many people know much about supportive housing. So I'm really grateful for you teaching so many people more about this process and really about what people need right now in our city. So thank you so much for coming on and being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, and we will see you guys next time on our next episode of This Week at Neighbors Together. And hopefully we'll be chatting with our chef Marcel, but we'll see. We will see you next time. And again, if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing at Neighbors Together, you can go to neighborstogether.org. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter at Neighbors Together. And we just always love hearing from you guys and hearing more about how you're supporting our work. So thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time.